I am in the beautiful city of Konya, one of the most significant and important cities for the history of Sufism and mysticism, and for several reasons. It was in this city and at the same time that people like Sadr Al-Qūnawī lived, who was the student, primary student and stepson of Ibn Arabi. Basically, it was here that he and his student started the Akbari school that carried forward the teachings of Ibn Arabi. At the same time, the great Persian poet Fakhruddin Iraqi came here, listened to the lectures of Qūnawī when he lectured about the Fusus al-Hikam, and wrote the Lama'at, or Divine Flashes, one of the most beautiful pieces of mystical literature in history. And of course, also at the same time, this was an insane time in history, and what is probably what this city is most famous for is, of course, what you see represented behind me, which is the tomb of the great Jalaluddin Rumi, or Mevlana as he is known locally. But let's back up a bit first. I've wanted to visit Konya for many years, since it's such a significant place for the history of the topics that I study. So we were very excited as we traveled from Stockholm first to Istanbul. This is a city that I've been to before and which I absolutely love. It's the meeting place of so many different cultures and peoples, really embodying the fact that it literally is the bridge between Europe and Asia. Of course, we had to pay a visit to the Hagia Sophia. I hadn't been there since it was converted back into a mosque, and the vibe was certainly a bit different compared to last time. The beautiful mosaics of Mother Mary and Jesus in the front of the building were covered over, which is perhaps understandable, but I still missed seeing them a little bit. There was something really beautiful about seeing the names of Allah and Muhammad right next to Mary and Jesus, which captured the complex history of this incredible building. Then we went to see the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, also known more famously as the Blue Mosque. The building was under renovation last time I was here, so it wasn't until this time that I was able to see it properly, and it is truly an amazing piece of architecture. The stained glass windows give the place a really unique look, and the calligraphy and art on the walls is simply breathtaking. One of my favorite parts of visiting Istanbul this time was going over to the Asian side of the city. Here, you can get away from some of the more intense touristy areas, and after some great coffee at a friend's coffee shop, we visited the dargah, or tomb, of the very significant Sufi master, poet, Islamic scholar, judge, and musical composer Aziz Mahmud Hudai. He is one of the most celebrated mystics of the Ottoman period, seen as one of the 4 patron saints of the Bosphorus, and was the founder, or at least an important originating figure, of the so-called Jalwati Sufi order. This was a tariqah that was strongly connected with the more famous Khalwati order, which has been one of the most widespread in history. The word khalwa means retreat and indicates one of the characteristic features of the order, their emphasis on the spiritual practice of retreat, where one will go into isolation for up to 40 days in contemplation and prayer. The Jalwati order is a kind of branch of the Khalwati, you could say. The name plays on the opposite of Khalwa, Jalwa, which means something like society or the public. There is the famous Sufi idea of khalwa fi jalwa, solitude in the crowd, for example. And while the Jalwatis have a lot in common with the Khalwati because of the shared lineage, as the name indicates, the Jalwati have emphasized the outwardness a little more. Things like service of others and outward actions of piety and charity, rather than inward retreat. Aziz Mahmud Hudai became one of the central figures of this tariqah, and he often talks about its principles in his very popular poetry that he wrote in Turkish. He was also one of the most significant Islamic scholars and judges of the Ottoman era in Istanbul and Bursa, and was actually, speaking of the Blue Mosque, when that mosque was built by Sultan Ahmed, Mahmud Hudai was so beloved by the Sultan that it was actually Mahmud Hudai that held the first khutbah in the mosque. The first sermon ever to be held in the Blue Mosque was by Mahmud Hudai. His tomb is in connection with his old tekke, or Sufi lodge, that he established, and which was quite a center of culture as well as Sufi activity back in the day. And as is often the case with places like this, his tomb is a very serene place, very sort of quiet and beautiful, with people coming to contemplate and remember one of the great saints in the city's history. After a few short days in Istanbul, enjoying some food and visiting all these places, it was time for the main part of the trip. We took a train from Istanbul that took us further inland to the city of Konya. Konya is a city that has been inhabited for thousands of years. It was inhabited by the Phrygians, by the Hittites, and for a long time it was also under the Roman Empire, both the ancient one but also the later East Roman or Byzantine Empire. But in the late 11th century, the city was conquered by the Seljuk Turks, thus coming under Muslim rule. And the Seljuks would make Konya the capital city of the Sultanate of Rum, the Roman province of their empire. Thus, by the late 12th and early 13th century, this was a flourishing city both politically and culturally. But it was also on the frontiers of the Muslim world in Anatolia. A large portion of the population were still non-Muslim, and those that had become Muslims didn't really have access to the learning and religious scholarship in more central areas like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, or Khorasan. So the religious literacy of the population was on a quite low level. So Konya, therefore, became a city ripe for scholars and religious figures to come and teach the population. As was usually the case, it was Sufism and these Sufi saints or awliya that were the most successful in attracting the local population and gaining converts to Islam. Under rulers like Izz-ud-Din Kaykaus and Alauddin Kayqubad, Sufi scholars were patronized and encouraged to come to the city and teach. The former Sultan Kaykaus was in regular contact with the great Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, who lived in the city occasionally and worked almost as a kind of advisor to the Sultan. And it was under the rule of his successor, Alauddin Kayqubad, that a significant family settled in the city around the year 1221. That of Bahauddin Valad, whose son, Jalal-ad-Din, would go on to become one of the greatest mystics in history, the man otherwise known as Rumi. It was in Konya that Rumi lived for most of his life. He is called Rumi because he was from Rome, right? This is a reference to the place where he lived, which was Konya in Rome. It was here that he established himself as a great Islamic scholar and succeeded his father as a prominent teacher. It was also here eventually that he met the enigmatic wandering dervish Shams-ad-Din Tabrizi, who would completely turn Rumi's life upside down and make him into an ecstatic mystic, one responsible for some of the greatest works of poetry ever composed. His massive poem, the Masnavi, has been called the Quran in Persian endearingly and is one of the great masterpieces of world literature. In many ways, Rumi represents a certain flavor of Sufism that emphasizes a particular concept, that of love. Love is indeed one of the most recurring and important themes in the poetry and the practice of Islam that he presents. This love is both on a practical, a mystical, and even a metaphysical level. It is this love, a love directed primarily at God, of course, but which also extends to love of things in the created world as expressions of God. It is this love that enables us to come closer to God, to fight against our nafs or self and ego until it becomes completely annihilated in God, fana fillah, so that we can only experience the oneness of God and of all things, and we have no idea of ourselves. Our idea of an I, of a self, is completely annihilated, and only God exists. In a poem he says, "You are your own shadow, become annihilated in the rays of the sun. How long will you look at your shadow? Look also at his light." Or in another poem where he expresses this bewilderment of the loss of the self in God, he says, "I am not me, you are not you, and you are not me. Yet I am me, you are you, and you are me as well. O idol of Khotan, with you I am such that I am in doubt whether I am you or you are me. Aside from all the classic Sufi practices like zikr and meditations and retreats, Rumi seems to have been especially fond of music. He was a musician himself, supposedly played the rabab, which was a bowed string instrument. And also one of his most famous selections or sections of poetry is, of course, the Song of the Reed, the Ney-Nameh, in which he celebrates the reed flute or the ney, which, the wailing of which becomes a mirror or metaphor for the wailing of the human soul in longing to return to God. It's incredible poetry, right? And so music was very dear to Rumi and as part of the spiritual journey and the spiritual practice. And this, of course, becomes very apparent in the Mevlevi Sufi order that was formed around him, in which music is also very central. His focus on the ma'ana, or essential meaning aspects of religion, rather than just outward legalism, also allowed him to have a stance that could be called perhaps tolerant of religious difference and diversity. Now, that isn't to say that the law didn't matter to him. It definitely did. Rumi was a Muslim and followed the Islamic law very strictly, but there is a certain softness in his approach. In some ways, each person has their own way to God, and it is the intention and the inner state of the worshipper that is most important, but without neglecting the outward aspect completely. Quote, "For Hindis, Hindi is for praise of God. The praise of God in Sindhi is for Sindhis. I am not sanctified by their laudations. It's they who are made holy, strewing pearls. We look at neither languages nor words, but at the soul and at the inner state. Inspecting hearts, we see if they are humble, although the spoken words are not so humble." This tolerant and compassionate, kind approach that Rumi seems to have had to religion and even just as a person more generally in his social interactions, it's said that Rumi was an incredibly compassionate and kind person. This all contributed to the fact that he was deeply loved in his day, being admired not only by fellow Muslims, but also by Christians and Jews living in Konya as well. And it was in Konya that he also died and was buried in 1273. His tomb makes up the most prominent landmark in the city to this day, that turquoise dome marking his resting place being unmistakable. The wider complex of the tomb was also the headquarters of the Mevlevi Sufi order that was formed around him, primarily by his son Sultan Valad. Throughout the centuries, this was the center for the Mevlevi order, and thus also the birthplace of the ritual of the Mevlevi Sema, widely known globally as the whirling dervishes. And this has become almost like a poster image for Sufism generally, even though it is actually a particular feature of the Mevlevi order and some related orders in Turkey. Rumi's legacy can truly be felt in Konya. He is remembered not just as a poet, but as one of the great spiritual masters and religious figures in history, one that inspires people not only locally, but all around the world. Today is the sheb-i, which means the wedding night, and this is the day when the death of the great Sufi poet and master Jalaluddin Rumi, or also known locally as Mevlana, is celebrated. Now, the word sheb-i, wedding night, this comes originally from the Arabic urs, which means wedding, and this symbolically represents that in Sufism it is believed that when someone dies, they are reunited with God, so symbolically like a wedding. So it's a very positive thing that is celebrated. And here in Konya, for basically the whole week leading up to this day, people from all around the world, not just Turkey, not just Sufis or Muslims, but from all around the world, from all nationalities, all religions and cultures, come here to commemorate and celebrate Mevlana, as he is known here locally. I'm actually standing right now in front of the entrance to his tomb, which, as you can see, is quite crowded with a lot of people, both tourists, but also people who are here for more sort of spiritual and religious reasons. This fact that people come from all walks of life shows you that Rumi really has a kind of universal appeal. I always clarify in my videos that he was a Muslim, of course, and he very adamantly saw himself as a Muslim. But that doesn't change the fact that his poems, his teachings, his spiritual personality has a universal appeal, right? It speaks to people regardless of their backgrounds. When you read his poems, whether it's the Masnavi or some of the shorter poems, there's just something very powerful and beautiful about them that seem to speak to the souls of people of all kinds of backgrounds. And that's really beautiful and can certainly be felt in a place like this and especially on a day like this. Konya is usually considered one of the most conservative cities in Turkey, a relatively quiet place. But during the week of the Sheb-i the city transforms completely. It's flooded with tourists from all around the world and it comes alive with all kinds of activity. I wasn't lying when I said that there is a huge diversity of different people that come to the city at this time. Everything from conservative Muslims making ziyarah or minor pilgrimage to the tomb of Rumi to what some people might call hippies basically, or spiritually inclined individuals without any formal religious affiliation. They all converge on Konya and Rumi during this week and take part in all kinds of events and activities. There are spontaneous jams and music performances all around, on the streets and in different hotels, people doing sema dancing workshops and just hanging out together. Now, even though practicing Sufism has technically been illegal in Turkey since the secularism of the 1920s, it's not exactly a secret that there are also formal gatherings of Sufi zikr, and even more so during Sheb-i. Many will also go to see a sema performance of the whirling dervishes that are put on basically every night, even if this is mostly a more cultural performance than an actual ritual. If you want to see something more quote-unquote authentic, you basically have to know someone, so to say. It's impossible to see and experience everything that happens here, and in between attending different gatherings and events, we also try to do some regular touristic activities as well. We are currently in the Al-Dīn Jami or mosque in Konya. This this mosque was finished by Al-Dīn Kayqubad, the famous sultan. It was finished in 1220 or 1221. So I'm not sure how much renovation has been done in this prayer hall, if this is the actual pillars or walls that existed back then. That I'll have to look that up. But given the fact that it was finished at that time, it's safe to assume that both Rumi and people like Ṣadr Al-Qūnawī would have prayed and perhaps led prayers in this very mosque, which is a pretty special thing to sort of just be here and surround yourself with that history. I think it's a very beautiful place, sort of classic Seljuk architecture. You see the beautiful pillars. Very sort of typical Seljuk 13th century architecture on the outside as well. I got some footage of the outside, so I feel very grateful to be able to be here and to be able to just be in that space that has so much history. Now, one of the most famous and important figures in the story of Rumi is, of course, his master, Shams-ad-Din Tabrizi, or Shams of Tabriz. His master that he dedicated his great divan to, and which a lot of his poems are about, and sort of most of the poems that he writes in his divan are written sort of from the voice of Shams. So this is why it's called the Divan Shams Tabrizi. And let's go this way, maybe. And right here, we're just coming up to the maqam, so-called, of Shams, which is the supposed tomb or maybe shrine of Shams. Now, one of the famous things about Shams, if you've watched my earlier video about it, or if you've read about Rumi, is that he one day up and disappears, right? He just vanishes, and no one really knows what actually happened to him. There are a few different theories. Here behind me is the complex, the tomb. No one really knows what happens to him. One theory is that he left. He left Konya, which Rumi was completely distraught over, and simply went maybe back home to Tabriz or to Iran or something. Another theory, however, is that he was actually murdered, that some of Rumi's students were so jealous that Rumi loved Shams so much that they actually murdered him. And one of the theories is that they murdered him and threw him down a well here in Konya. So the well is supposed to be here somewhere. Is it perhaps that thing there? This was not the well, unfortunately. This is Ishaq Pasha tomb. So maybe we could... Is that the well? Assalamu alaikum. Could this be it? I'm not sure how legitimate the claim that the well is still here even is, but this looked like it could have been a well at some point, but I'm not sure it is right now. It looks like it's some sort of... Yeah, it's just a tree planted. We later found a plaque that said that the well is basically inside the building and in the cellar, which is inaccessible to the public. So, there's that. I'm just going to let myself keep looking like a fool. But this is the back of the building. You can see the beautiful minaret here of Shams's supposed tomb. Again, no one knows for sure if he died here and was buried here or if he disappeared, but this is one place that he's claimed to have been buried. But this is, I'm probably going to shoot some better footage of the actual place here in the square so I can put in some B-roll. But that's basically it. This is the place that's claimed to be the tomb of Shams Tabrizi. I don't think we're going to film inside the actual tomb because it's sort of a place for people to contemplate and so on. But it's a really beautiful square, and that's all I have to say for now. So right now I'm standing in front of the tomb of Ṣadr Al-Qūnawī, who was the stepson and primary student of the great Sufi master Ibn Arabi. His name Qūnawī, of course, means from Konya, so this is where I'm at, obviously. So he was from here, he lived here for most of his life. He grew up for much of his life in the household of Ibn Arabi and became his primary student. And after Ibn Arabi died, Al-Qūnawī became really the main successor to the master. He is the one who basically started the Akbari school, the school of Ibn Arabi. And for the most part here in Konya. It was here with his students like Al-Farghani, Al-Jandi, later on Fakhruddin Iraqi, for example, where he was the one that was commenting on works like the Fusus al-Hikam, that was systematizing the work of Ibn Arabi to a much larger extent in a sort of philosophical way that really led to the Akbari school as we know it and the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud. Indeed, Al-Qūnawī is actually the first figure in history that uses the term Wahdat al-Wujud. Ibn Arabi never used it himself. Al-Qūnawī uses it in one of his texts, although he doesn't use it as a technical term, but still this is very significant. You can see his tomb behind me here. There's a mosque connected to it, also a place in the mosque supposedly where he would go on khalwa, on retreats. It's a very small sort of confined space where you can sort of enter and sit. You can barely fit. You can only sit if you sort of sit on your knees basically, and it's pitch dark in there. It's a very special experience. Compared, you can see the tomb. It's the sort of triangular roof behind me. Very sort of humble, beautiful place, very peaceful. It's right next to a street here, but inside it's like an oasis where it's very calm and very sort of serene, I would say. And especially the contrast is quite striking compared to the tomb of Rumi, which is just like 30 minutes walk that way, which is this grand, incredibly ornamented like museum and incredibly like powerful place. Compared to that, this is very humble, but I think in some ways there's something even more powerful about the sort of serene and peaceful nature of this place. It's also quite interesting in that sense because at the time, Qūnawī and Rumi were friends. They knew each other and they were friendly with each other. Although at that point, Al-Qūnawī was actually the one who had probably the highest like religious authority. He was the Sheikh al-Islam of Konya at that time. Whereas Rumi was perhaps more popular with the general population. He was a very popular poet and Sufi master. Al-Qūnawī had a higher status in the sort of religious and maybe even political sphere. But if we compare that to the way their tombs today sort of look, the difference is quite striking, right? That's a sort of interesting comparison. One of the most significant people of the early school that came to study with Qūnawī was the Persian poet Fakhruddin Iraqi. By the time he arrived in Konya, he was already a Sufi master himself of the Suhrawardi order, but still came to sit at the feet of Qūnawī as he was lecturing about Ibn Arabi's masterpiece, the Fusus al-Hikam, the bezels of wisdom. And this shows you something about the stature of Qūnawī as a teacher at that time. In the evenings, the little group would gather to hear Qūnawī give his interpretation of the Fusus, and afterwards, Iraqi would write down the insights and inspirations he had received from it. What resulted from these quote-unquote notes was a work called the Lama'at, the divine flashes or sparks. This has become one of the most famous and celebrated works of mystical literature in the Islamic world, a combination of prose and poetry that explicates the doctrine of Ibn Arabi, known as Wahdat al-Wujud, or the oneness of being, through the language of love, as expressed in works like Ahmad Ghazali's Savaneh. And it is one of my personal favorite pieces of mystical literature. It explores the Akbarian ideas that, at the end of the day, there is nothing but God. All of the world is simply a manifestation or reflection of his beautiful attributes in the oneness of being. We, as lovers, seek our beloved, God, and eventually are able to unite with him, but only to realize, when duality falls away, that all that ever existed was the reality of love itself, identified with the essence of God. Iraqi says, "Then the eye of certainty opens, and staring inwardly at himself, he finds himself lost, vanished. But he finds the friend, and when he looks still deeper, realizes the friend is himself. He exclaims, 'Beloved, I sought you here and there, asked for news of you from all I met, then saw you through myself, and found we were identical. Now I blush to think I ever searched for signs of you.'" To be in Konya and know that such a fantastic and important work of literature was composed in this very place is a special feeling in itself, and it all just adds another layer to the importance of Konya for the history of mysticism.